In addition to being a fan of Godzilla and Gamera, I'm also a huge fan of King Kong. Like my first exposure with Godzilla, I was introduced to King Kong at a very young age, and it was by my father finding the 1933 original playing on TV. Naturally, if it was a giant creature of any form, I would have easily gotten into it with no question. I was majorly fascinated with giant monsters, and King Kong was no exception. So when I learned that Legendary was planning a prequel to King Kong, I naturally got excited. It was definitely the right time to reboot the King Kong franchise, given that other monster properties like Pacific Rim and Godzilla 2014 proved to be critical and financial successes. Then when I heard that Legendary scrapped their prequel plans in favor of creating a shared cinematic universe between Godzilla and Kong, I lost my shit. I said it before and I'll say it again. It truly is a wonderful time to be a kaiju fan. Kong Skull Island is one of those rare blockbusters that delivers on what it promises. Not that the film was predictable or anything, but I left the theater pleased with a smile on my face. If you felt disappointed by Godzilla 2014, then Kong Skull Island would definitely make up for it. Don't get me wrong, I love Godzilla 2014, but in many ways, Kong Skull Island feels like the anti-Godzilla 2014. Kong Skull Island has more monster battles, more screen time for Kong, better characters, plenty of humor, and doesn't take itself too seriously. Don't get me wrong, I do feel like it's unfair to compare the two films, given that Godzilla 2014 is a disaster movie and Kong Skull Island is an adventure movie, but they're both MonsterVerse movies, so the need to compare the two is unavoidable. But yes, I do feel like there were better characters in this film. In Godzilla 2014, the only character worth caring about was Bryan Cranston's character, but he got killed off in the first 40 minutes, and we're left with Aaron Taylor Johnson and other characters that audiences just didn't sympathize with like they did with Cranston's character. Kong Skull Island has the opposite effect with its characters. They're more colorful and more enjoyable to hang with for 2 hours. John C. Reilly's Hank Marlowe was easily the best character. Reilly delivers the goofball performance that you've come to expect from him, but he's also the heart and soul of the movie. Samuel L. Jackson delivers a pretty solid performance, but I felt that he should have been the main character. The film should have been more centered on Packard and his quest for revenge against Kong rather than having it as a backdrop. Instead, the film gets stuck with excruciatingly average characters played by Tom Hiddleston and Brie Larson. While they deliver better performances than Aaron Taylor Johnson did in Godzilla 2014, there's still nothing special. Not like Marlowe or what could have been with Packard. But the rest of the movie makes up for any issues, and that's thanks to the director, Jordan Vogt-Roberts. Roberts manages to have fun with the material while at the same time successfully balancing the tone. It's serious when it needs to be, and it's fun and quirky when it needs to be. At the same time, Roberts doesn't even try to compete with the 1933 original, but rather have his own movie be its own thing. Another thing Roberts achieved greatly is how he handles the world building in the MonsterVerse. Unlike Batman vs Superman, Kong Skull Island doesn't force elements that set up sequels. They're done subtly. Its main concern is telling its own story first and expanding the MonsterVerse secondary. What failed with Batman vs Superman is that it stopped its own movie multiple times and dedicated a number of scenes to setting up Justice League and other sequels. What Kong Skull Island does better is that it leaves breadcrumbs that could potentially be picked up and explored more in sequels. Audiences wouldn't think twice about these breadcrumbs because it doesn't interfere with the movie. Unlike in Batman vs Superman, where the film's breadcrumbs did interfere with the movie so bad that it was excruciatingly obvious and obnoxious. What I did find obnoxious with Kong Skull Island was the lack of consistent continuity with the MonsterVerse. Godzilla 2014 stated that Monarch was established in 1954 after Godzilla's appearance, as a coalition between countries to study him.
The organization we work for, Monarch, was established in the wake of this discovery. A multinational coalition formed in secrecy to search for him, study him, learn everything we could.
But now, Kong Skull Island states that Monarch was established in 1946 by Harry Truman.
Harry Truman didn't think so when he funded Monarch in 1946.
Another thing I found obnoxious was the deaths of John Goodman and John Ortiz. The movie stops itself for a minute just to kill off John Ortiz, and John Goodman's death was very anticlimactic. John Ortiz should have been the one to be eaten by the Skullcrawler, and John Goodman should have been the one to be stomped on by Kong, but this is just me nitpicking. The special effects were another element of the movie that I really loved. Seriously, there are moments where Kong doesn't even look like a CG animation, and even in scenes where it's obvious he is an animation, it's done so fluidly and precise. Whichever company did the CG should be kept on for the rest of the MonsterVerse because they delivered some of the best CG eye candy I've seen in a monster movie. Speaking of eye candy, just like Godzilla 2014, Kong Skull Island has some great cinematography. It's been made crystal clear that Apocalypse Now was a heavy influence on the movie, and it shows. It's great to see a reboot of one of my favorite monsters pay homage to one of my favorite war films. This version of Kong is also one of my favorite iterations to date. He's big, strong, fast, and powerful. I love how this design is a mixture of every King Kong that came before. I see hints of 1933 in there, hints of Toho's Kongs, and the 1976 Kong as well. It's like this design was one big homage to the King Kongs that came before. Speaking of homages, the soundtrack by Henry Jackman sounds like an homage to John Barry's soundtrack for the 1976 King Kong remake. There are some tunes here and there that are very reminiscent of John Barry's score, but Jackman also brings a solid and worthy style and flavor to the soundtrack. My personal favorite tracks that I love to play over and over again are Project Monarch, Packard's Blues, Man vs. Beast, and Monster Mash. Overall, Kong Skull Island was one hell of a monster movie that truly delivered what it promised. It is one of the year's best films. Although, I felt that it was a waste that Skullcrawlers were the only major threats to Kong, but the movie makes up for it by delivering some awesome, anime-influenced monster battles that last long enough to satisfy action junkies like myself. Kong Skull Island is the prime example of why we go to the movies. It's an insanely entertaining film filled with fun, humor, and surprisingly, a certain level of heart and soul. Kong Skull Island does not try to compete with the 1933 original. Instead, it captures the spirit of what we all felt when we first saw that movie. A sense of awe, adventure, and irresistible fun. But it also feels like a classic kaiju movie that Toho would have produced during the 60s. Out of all the cinematic universe franchises out there, I'm so glad that the MonsterVerse is not struggling, unlike a certain cinematic universe also owned by Warner Brothers. The MonsterVerse isn't concerned with world building, it's concerned with telling its stories first and setting up sequels secondary. With Kong Skull Island becoming a financial and critical success, the MonsterVerse is off to a good start. Hopefully it keeps growing strong and big so that we might get more movies after Godzilla vs. Kong. I would love to see Gamera join the MonsterVerse. I award Kong Skull Island 3.5 stars out of 4.